I was watching this LSU Texas A&M game over the weekend, which I definitely thought was certainly the most anticipated game going into week 9. And it was, all things considered, it was really a strong game for Texas A&M. I mean, obviously they struggled in the first half. They made the change to Connor Weigman, and then all of a sudden it seemed like Marcel Reed was essentially the spark that they needed to overcome LSU and really get a strong victory at Kyle Field. They're now on a 7-game win streak, 5-0 in SEC play, and cemented being number one in the SEC. I could certainly make a run at winning the SEC title as well. And obviously, the biggest matchup for him for the rest of the season will more than likely be them playing Texas later this season. But as I look at this Texas game, I mean, at this Texas A&M LSU game, there are a couple things that come to mind. I think first and foremost, you ask yourself the following two questions. I think first, now that Texas A&M, has that statement win versus LSU, where does that lead them in terms of the SEC championship race and the college football playoff? And then secondarily, you have to ask yourself, has Marcel Reed earned the starting job over Connor Weigman, going forward for the rest of the season? So I think it makes sense first to address the Marcel Reed quarterback controversy part of the conversation. Now, obviously Marcel Reed played earlier in the season because, Connor Weigman was dealing with some lingering issues. And, as someone who's covered Florida over the past couple seasons, the game that I've, been seeing that I remember most vividly with Marcel Reed was when he, pretty much just flat out dominated Florida. And if you go back and watch that game, that going into the third quarter, when they had a 98-yard drive going down Florida, and they essentially ran 14 straight running plays, and Florida simply had no answers to it. And even if you go back and watch my preview of the LSU Texas A&M game, my entire thing was pretty much saying, "Hey, whoever is going to have the best rushing attack is going to win the football game." And as you saw going into you know them scoring pretty much 5 straight drives, that was essentially what sort of led Texas A&M to win. Now, obviously, let's give Texas A&M defensive line a ton of credit too, because they, were ultimately the catalyst in making sure and seeing that Garrett Nussmeier had three interceptions in that game, and you know, and they were able to capitalize on those turnovers most importantly too. So let's make sure that we're also giving Texas A&M's defense a lot of credit. And Mike Elko's definitely had a really stellar year one at College Station, and he deserves a hell of a lot of credit too. So definitely shout out to him and the Aggies too, who it's been a long time coming for him for this year. And as somebody who was you know old enough to remember the Johnny Manziels, the Kevin Sumlins, and then obviously before they made the jump to the SEC, they were in the Big 12. They were a staple in the Big 12 for a long time. So certainly you got to be excited if you're an Aggies fan, and especially how they've persevered and came back after that Notre Dame loss in week 1. It's definitely been exciting to see, and definitely it makes you wonder too, because I've pretty much said consistently on the show, I've defended Connor Weigman, saying like, hey, he's, is he? Do I think he's an elite talent? Not necessarily, but I do think he has a pretty high ceiling, all things considered. I mean, you know, the athletic ability is clearly there. He can be dangerous in certain situations. He, you know, he is the guy. If you're going to have a more balanced attack, I would argue that you're probably going to have to go with him over Marcel Reed, because if you ask yourself at this point, you know, looking at Marcel Reed's resume right now and just kind of thinking about Wegman's skill set compared to Reed, it's not so much necessarily that Reed hasn't been successful when he's on the field. I think at this point you're asking yourself, if you're a Texas A&M fan, how is the offense would change under Marcel Reed if they decided to commit to him full time? Because I mean, as you can see on the bottom of the ticker, they're averaging 232 yards of rushing, led by Le'Veon Moss. And, that's clearly going to be the bread and butter of this team. I think to some extent, if you're Colin Klein, you have to ask yourself, you know, to what extent do you want to commit to running to really running the ball? 'Cause obviously that's what was working for LSU, and they had enough momentum to get that. They were really put in a couple key positions where it ultimately made sense for them to run. But can that be the long term strategy in terms of getting to an SEC championship and getting to a college football playoff? I don't think that's as much set in stone you know as people may think. I mean, yes, we've seen him have successes. You do have to kind of wonder, can Weigman stay healthy again? Because if you do decide to go back to Weigman and then he sort of struggles again, or if he gets injured, then the entire conversation is going to come back to, why get rid of the hot hand? Because Marcel Reed, he's athletic, yes, he's a bigger dual threat. He's he's proven that he can extend the field a little bit in terms of whether you want to run some more zone reads or some RPOs, or get the screenplay more involved too. Because I think too, if you are going to go back to Weigman, I think one of the bigger concerns that, in my opinion, got overlooked was the pass protection for Texas A&M. I think was a little bit left to be desired in that game, because I think if it was one of those situations where LSU didn't turn the ball over and they didn't have some favorable starts on those drives, I think we're having a completely different conversation right now. So it goes to show that if I think a lot of different things went Texas A&M's way, that if maybe one or two things don't change, I don't think they come back from that. Because all things considered, if you're LSU, you had a great start to the first half, and really all you had to do was just kind of continue that momentum and not make too many critical mistakes to the point where you possibly give Texas A&M a chance to come back. But also, I mean, let's point out this, why we're here too, that Mike Elko deserves a ton of credit for making a ballsy move like that. I mean, I think in this day and age of college football, obviously a lot of people aren't as patient as they used to be. I mean, we can even go back and think about the Texas Georgia game where Quinn Ewers was benched for essentially a quarter until Steve Sarkisian kind of said to himself, like, oh shit, obviously, shouldn't be throwing Arch Manning to the Wolves against the Georgia defense. He's playing pretty freaking great right now. But when you think about this Texas A&M team, the defensive line was phenomenal. They did enough to certainly get Nussmeier rattled, and really he lost his rhythm in the second half too. And I talked about this before, but playing at Kyle Field at the 12th man is certainly an atmosphere that is always going to be an advantage too. And even going into this game too, I mean, both these teams have flip-flopped back and forth in terms of who has won the past couple meetings against them. But it's not so much an indictment against LSU necessarily. I mean, granted, they should have handled business a little bit better. They could have cleaned up the turnovers a little bit, and I don't think they got Caden Durham going as much as you could have. But at the same time, maybe this is the Aggies' moment to kind of shine and let them be established as a legitimate SEC program that deserves some recognition too. Because even up to this point, we had up to 9 SEC teams ranked. I mean, last week, Vandy was 25. You have Missouri in there. You have Tennessee, Ole Miss, Alabama, Georgia. So there's literally no room for error whatsoever. But the biggest difference you're going to have with Marcel Reed is yes, we saw that 54-yard touchdown, and yes, he only passed for 70 yards. But I think anybody who's watched Texas A&M enough this year to know that Marcel Reed's real strength is the athleticism and the running portion of it. It's not necessarily that Marcel Reed, can't make those plays. It's how can Colin Klein make those adjustments to the point where it's sustainable for, a legitimate playoff or SEC championship run. Now, I think they're going to have some opportunities to test some things out and, possibly, maybe experiment with having Marcel Reed start the game, but at the same time, you're in a tough spot because, you know, I do think you have to shift around this offense a little bit more than people expect, but you do have a great defense there, and the secondary came to play too. So when you look at this, all things considered, I would argue that at the moment it's probably Connor Wegman's job still, but I don't think anybody would necessarily be surprised if Marcel Reed earned the starting job. But I think if you do decide to hand the reins to Marcel Reed, you have to ask yourself, what adjustments is Colin Klein going to make, particularly on the offensive line? I think you have to ask yourself, to what extent are they going to be, committing to this rushing attack? Obviously 230 yards and all that. That's obviously there, but I would be more curious to see how much of it is it going to be in terms of the foundation moving forward too. So, is it going to look more like a Michigan offense or a Penn State offense where, they do decide to rely on that a little bit more, and they're going to be grinding out teams. They're going to try to win the time of possession, because I mean, historically, when you think of Colin Klein offenses, they aren't necessarily like that too. So I'm definitely curious, watching this SEC race moving forward, how that's going to turn out. But if you're Texas A&M, I think you're in a pretty good spot right now. I mean, you're on a really strong win streak right now. You're 5-0 in SEC play. You're handling business right now, and quite frankly, all things are moving in the right direction too. And I think, as we saw this week at Kyle Field, it's going to be more important than ever for them to really make sure that they have home field advantage, that the defense continues to show up as strong as they are, and that this could be a team that could be a dark horse. I mean, I think a lot of people saw what Texas A&M can do, and especially when LSU was coming off a really strong win versus Ole Miss and having that comeback win. I mean, it goes to show too that you know how much things carry over from week to week. Really are kind of coming full circle now, because we're at the point where two thirds into the season, everybody's about 7 games in, and you're kind of starting to figure out what are teams' strengths, what are teams' weaknesses. How are teams responding to adversity, and Texas A&M. This gets said over and over again, but they have a lot of resources there. There's always a lot of pressure at College Station, and the fan base has been waiting such a long time for this moment that it would be incredible to see for Texas A&M to win an SEC title and to make a legitimate run at this. But I think right now, the biggest key is obviously how do they handle this Weigman Reed situation, because I do think it's a little bit more um, I do think it's a little bit more sensitive than people are making it sound. I think if you haven't watched Texas A&M and SEC football as much this year, I think a lot of people are probably leaning towards, hey, go with the hot read with Marcel Reed, and yes, that's a big primetime win, but at the same time, if you watched Wegman before, he is a gamer, he is athletic, and there is a lot more upside to him than I think people are not necessarily considering. But can Texas A&M win this SEC title? It's possible. I mean, right now they are the favorite, but I think you have to ask yourself if this Texas A&M's defensive line in particular, if they can win that battle in the trenches just like Georgia's defensive line did, and Texas A&M make sure that they're not getting, those running backs aren't getting yards after catch, that they're eliminating those quick reads, those quick screen plays. And if you're also Texas, how comfortable are they really with Quinn Ewers? How quickly could they possibly go back to Arch if they were to have a slow start again versus a team like Texas A&M, when that game is likely going to have significant implications when it comes to the SEC championship and the college football playoff.